We're going to take some time to talk about reading and marking up manuscripts to support yourself in reading them. There's a little bit of construction going on in the building right now, so if you hear loud banging in the background, all's well. They're just tearing out walls upstairs. Reading out loud for listeners to hear is an art form. Consider the difference between the Jim Dale reading of the Harry Potter audiobooks, where he does different accents and voices for every character, versus a computer reading the text with no intonation whatsoever. Consider news readers reading off a teleprompter, but sounding as if they are not reading off a teleprompter. These voices bring text alive and make it accessible and help shape the meaning and key points so that you take those things away and it's easier for you to hear. The only way to get better at this is to practice it. You might prefer to practice in privacy and a quiet space. You might like to be outdoors. You might want to be with friends, hearing and receiving it. Recording yourself, say on your phone, and listening back is invaluable. And if recording yourself and watching the recording is too much, just listen back. You've probably got an audio recorder on your phone. There are a huge number of ways to do this well, and there's no one right pattern. The goal is not to read in one particular way. In our tradition, there is not one right way of preaching. And incidentally, it sounds like an old white Harvard-educated New Englander. No. The goal here is to become conscious of the way that you're preaching, to become aware of the different tools of voice that you're using. First, to become aware, and then to understand the impact that they have, the difference that it makes to use those tools. And then ultimately, and it will take time to get there, to use those tools intentionally, to read and to preach the way that you do because you're choosing to do it that way and because you know why you're choosing to do it that way. Okay, 4 main tools of the voice. As you read, consider these 4 main tools: volume, loud volume and soft volume. Speed. You can talk really quickly and you can go and go and go, but sometimes that's too fast and you need to slow things down. And of course, there's a wide range of tempos in between those 2 extremes. And then silence. Short pauses, long silences, an intentional rushing forward without a pause to create a sense of urgency and maybe even overwhelm. And then finally, pitch. Pitch is something to think about because it can make a difference. The pitch, the tone at which you're speaking. Are you staying, as I sometimes fall into, at one tone all the time? And it's very soothing and it's very nice. And soon your listeners have been lulled into a beautiful and quiet sleep. Only do that when the pews are really comfortable. Use these 4 tools: volume, speed, silence, and pitch, to stay interesting, to keep attention, and to serve the content. You're not just using these things haphazardly. Oh, it'd be nice if I talk really fast right now. You're using them to make a point. The way you leave silence after you've made your point, for example. Use these tools to serve the content, to make it accessible, more understandable to your listeners. And above all, the goal of using all 4 of these tools is to preach like yourself, not to preach like someone else, certainly not to preach like me, not to preach in the preacher voice that says interesting things, but to sound like you And maybe your dynamic range of natural volume goes from like here to like here, you know? And it's not hugely large and enormous. That's okay. Sound like you know what you're doing. Know why you're doing it. Maybe, you know, look, the point is to sound like you, to preach like you, but to do it because you're choosing to do it, not because that's the only mode you have. Earlier in my preaching life, I would get feedback about how warm and comforting my preaching was. And it was really unfortunate to get that feedback if I'm preaching like a rousing call to action and people's response is like, oh, I just felt so soothed by that. If you're afflicting the comfortable, don't comfort them, afflict them. But part of what was going on with that, part of why I was getting that feedback, was that my pace, my rhythm, my tone was all in this mode of just being really soothing. And everything was soothing. And I would preach like this. I mean, I'm exaggerating it a little bit, but not a huge amount. And the problem with all of this was that this was the only way I knew how to do it. I couldn't vary it up. Even there, when I said couldn't, I emphasized couldn't with pitch. I couldn't vary it up. I couldn't change these things because I wasn't really conscious of them. And this was my default mode, not because I was choosing to do it this way, but because that was the only way I knew how to do it. I was totally unconscious of that mode. So the point in that, at first, part of me felt like, oh no, I'm being asked, I'm being challenged to sound like someone else who is not me. But that's not really true. For me, it first took some shaking up and shaking out of that normal mode, that baseline mode. It wasn't then that I was choosing to sound that way. It was that I didn't know how to do it any other way. So, of course, that's the way I preach when I don't know how to do it any other way. But the point is to develop the skills so that you're intentionally choosing. You're choosing for the mode of your delivery to match what you're delivering, all on top of an authentic presentation of yourself and a speaking that your listeners can hear and understand. Okay. That's the tools of the voice. Let's talk a little bit about marking up. For those of us who preach from a manuscript, who have the vision to do it also, it's useful to mark up your pages to help cue you how you want to speak and preach those words. Because, of course, plain words on a page can be read in lots of different ways. Plain words on a page can be read lots of different ways. Don't read it like that. Plain words on a page can be read in lots of different ways. I mean, also probably don't preach that way either. But the point is there's so many different things that you can bring to the text, emphasizing particular places. Maybe inside your text there is a spot that should move fast. Maybe there's a spot that should move really slow. Maybe there are places to pause, or words to really emphasize, or a note to yourself that you need to remember. So in all of these things, and I'm overdrawing these examples a little bit, I tend to be a little bit more subtle, I think, than some of that in my own preaching, but the point is, in all of this, marking up your manuscript can be a tool and a cue for you to help remember how you want to deliver the thing. Make your life easy. Seriously. So we're going to do this exercise by looking at a piece of poetry and marking it up for reading. And this is one that I love, 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 called December by Gary Johnson. I've used this sometimes in Christmas services. Let's read through this together. December by Gary Johnson. A little girl is singing for the faithful to come ye, joyful and triumphant, a song she loves. And also the partridge in a pear tree and the golden rings and the turtle doves in the dark streets, red lights and green and blue where the faithful live, some joyful, some troubled, enduring the cold, also the flu, taking the garbage out and keeping the sidewalks shoveled. Not much triumph going on here. And yet there is much we do not understand. And my hopes and fears are met in this small singer holding on to my hand. Onward we go, faithfully, into the dark. And are there angels hovering overhead? Hark. So I love it. I think it's beautiful, it's sweet, it's tender. I like it too because I feel like it speaks to the complexity and the ordinariness of life, which is also like something that's important to me, even at sort of momentous occasions like a Christmas Eve service, say, to acknowledge the way that the holy is woven into the ordinary. Anyways, what I want to do here is suggest that there are other ways of reading this poem which would sound very different. After all, the thing rhymes. A little girl is singing for the faithful to come ye, joyful and triumphant, a song she loves. And also the partridge in a pear tree, and the golden rings, and the turtle doves. In the dark streets, red lights and green and blue, where the faithful live, some joyful, some troubled, enduring the cold and also the flu, taking the garbage out and keeping the sidewalk shoveled. Not much triumph going on here, and yet there's much we do not understand. And my hopes and fears are met in this small singer holding on to my hand. Onward we go, faithfully, into the dark. And are there angels hovering overhead? Hark. Now, I'm reading that a little bit extra obnoxiously, but the point here is that you can do things like overemphasize the rhymes, overemphasize the rhythm, and on, put emphasis on every single word. And are there angels hovering? So what I want to do is in this, mark some of this up. So 4 things I want to do. A vertical slash or 2, where you want to pause. An underline for emphasis. I like to do an arrow at the end of a line where it's not a pause. Especially important in poetry too, because the line breaks are not necessarily indicative of places you need to stop and take a breath. I mean, check out the punctuation here. Period, here, 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 here. But that's just 4 lines out of all of them where the author is sort of saying this represents the conclusion of an idea. And even where the author puts a period doesn't mean that that isn't, absolutely a place you must stop. I mean, there's much we do not understand. You could stop there and just let it sit for a while before continuing. But maybe the idea, maybe the thing you want to capture is there is much we do not understand, and my hopes and fears are met in this small singer. So just because there's a certain punctuation, you have to take it seriously, but that doesn't determine the way that it must be read. I'm waving my hand just off camera. Okay, so we've got 2 slashes for pause, underline for emphasis, arrow for not a pause, and stage directions. Because, and I put these in brackets usually, so those stage directions are things that you might want to do with your body or reminders to yourself. So if there was a very long pause that you wanted to make, you could imagine putting in brackets, take very long pause here, or putting in brackets, smile, a big smile for something joyful, or putting in brackets, stretch your arms out to show the breadth of a thing. The stage directions are directions to yourself for yourself, so that you don't have to remember to do those things right in the moment. So let's actually run through and do some of this. To apply this stuff. A little girl is singing for the faithful to come ye joyful and triumphant. So I would probably continue on here to sort of emphasize that come ye joyful and triumphant is like a connected lyric. A song she loves. And also the partridge in a pear tree and the golden rings and the turtle doves. And then I would pause here because it's sort of completing this thought of what she's doing, and we're switching idea and place. So we want to give people a second for this to land, and for them to sort of orient themselves inside of the scene that's happening here. A little girl is singing for the faithful to come ye joyful and triumphant, a song she loves. And also the partridge in a pear tree and the golden rings and the turtle doves. In the dark streets, red lights and green and blue. So I might put a note here to myself, just write in a stage direction to slow this down. And the golden, because this is a list here, right? Also the partridge in a pear tree and the golden rings and the turtle doves. Pause and slow. In the dark streets, red lights and green and blue, where the faithful live, some joyful, some troubled. And here, I'm catching myself sort of doing it naturally, but this is an example where you've got your two different states of being that are contrasted with each other. So consider the difference between reading this line, where the faithful live, some joyful, some troubled, versus where the faithful live, some joyful, some troubled. I don't know that that's the right way, intonation to give exactly, but you get the point. There's a very big difference in emphasis if it's some joyful, some troubled, versus some joyful, some troubled. And I want to emphasize these two things rather than the some and the some, because the idea here is that, all of us are both of these things at one point or another. So I want to emphasize the states of being because it's the listener who is also part of this. I mean, we're describing here not something that's happening to other people, but also something that's happening to us. Where the faithful live, some joyful, some troubled, enduring the cold and also the flu, taking the garbage out. So I want to keep going here because this, idea is sort of united. I want to emphasize the connectedness of all these qualities of the ordinariness of life, enduring the cold and also the flu, taking the garbage out, and keeping the sidewalk shoveled. Pause again. Not much triumph, and let's emphasize triumph. Not much triumph going on here. And then I realized, there's the em dash here already, which may cue you to a pause, but I'm not just going to rely on that. I'm going to put in a little note to myself so that I know not to hurry on through that. Not much triumph going on here, and maybe there's a little bit of an emphasis on here. Not much triumph going on here, and yet there is much we do not understand. And my hopes and fears are met in this small singer holding onto my hand. Onward we go, faithfully, into the dark. So here, I'm not underlining everything, but I think this is about, it's the onward faithfully into the dark. And are there angels hovering overhead? Hark. So I think I sort of did it naturally, but, I might make a note to myself of real warmth, because I think this ending is so tender. So we're starting, with 4 lines of here's this little girl singing about the Christmas carols, and it's just sort of wacky, and joyful and triumphant is both the allusion to the Christmas Carol and also the way she's singing it. You can sort of imagine this little girl singing joyful and triumphant, contrasted with 4 lines of here's just sort of the ordinary griminess of life that keeps on going even in this season. And then here's the turn in these 4 stanzas, or 4 lines, excuse me. Not much triumph going on here. And so there's a turn back to tenderness. So maybe this is obnoxious and weird and random. Why are we singing about partridges in a pear tree? It's Christmas. Maybe it's Christmas Eve and you've heard these things so many times. Oh my God, stop playing this music again. And my hopes and fears are met in this small singer holding on to my hand. I mean, that is tenderness. That is tenderness. Because this is her experience. Her experience in this moment is just unabashedly, uncomplicatedly joyful and triumphant. And then our collective experience is effing complicated. And here these 2 things are meeting. And that sort of adult and cynical feeling turns back to wonder again. And onward we go faithfully into the dark. So maybe the stage direction is warm or tender. It's this reminder of how it feels. So there's not a huge amount of markup that I'm doing here. It's really just these sort of key moments. Don't forget to keep moving at the end of this line. Don't forget to let it breathe right here. Don't forget that the parallel construction you want to emphasize is joyful and troubled. Put together the list of all the things that are going on in our complicated lives, and then let it sit so that people can digest these things that they themselves have also been doing. The point here is triumph, and don't forget to pause, and then don't forget to turn back to that warmth and tenderness at the end of it. So look, in all of this, it's not, I just want to pause and re-emphasize this again, that it's not that the way that I marked it up is the right way to do it. It's not necessarily the way you want to read it. And in fact, you may well have been listening and watching me go through that and saying, you're missing this or that or the other thing. You're totally overlooking this feeling or this construction of words or this phrase, whatever it is. And that's wonderful. Or you may be listening and thinking, oh my God, I would never read that like he does. Also, perfectly fine. The point that we're making here, the exercise that we're doing today, isn't about how do you read things like I read things. The point of it is, how do you mark them up in a way that supports your reading of them? Marking them up in a way that takes seriously the meaning of the text and helps you make that meaning clearer to your listener and helps support you in using the 4 tools of voice: volume, speed, silence, and pitch. I encourage you to find some poetry to do this with yourself. Mark it up. Experiment with reading it in wildly different ways. Read the same piece of poetry, angry, sad, happy, bored, exuberant, warm, on and on and on, so that you can start to feel in your voice and body, what are the possibilities? Part of the point of marking up your text and of using the tools of the voice is so that you don't make your listeners work harder than they have to work. You could read it as if you were a computer with no understanding of the meaning of the words that you're saying. But that puts a lot more work on your listener to, in that very moment, understand every bit of what you're saying and the nuance of it and make their own meaning from it also. Tools of the voice are, and marking up to support them, are ways to make it easier for your listeners to hear you. Now, Ultimately, the meaning exists in the space between you and them. You're not closing the door on the possible meanings or understandings that they take away, but you're making the text more accessible to them so that they can get to their own work of engagement with the text faster and more easily. What I mean is, the meaning of preaching is not just the stuff that you're saying, but the work that your listener is doing, the engagement that they have with it, which may spin into directions wildly different than anything you contemplated. And what you want to do is make it possible, make it easier on them to be doing their work as they're hearing you. And ultimately, that's what this is in service of. It's in service of the text and the meaning that you bring to it, and it's in service of the meaning that your listeners are making as they're engaged in it.